if you have, what stories you have heard from women in Hong Kong, you know, kind of how they construct these entire new identities of gender and then relate to one another in terms of these new identities. Okay.
If there are any more questions, we'll take a few more and try to address them.
This question is for Marie Conning. It's about the migrant workers and I'm specifically speaking about Iraq because that's where I work and I come from. In the last few years, so like we all know that the US established a government in Iraq and they put everything in place in the ministries, but in the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, nothing was put in place onto migrant workers. We found 17 Ugandan domestic workers who were heavily abused in the houses, and the IOM did not do their homework, were not good in doing their homework. So I'm just suggesting to add Iraq to the list of the Arab countries and the Gulf countries, and to write some sort of recommendation to the IOM that they need to have some sort of connection or control over the Iraqi government and the way they are allowing the abuse of the migrant domestic workers in Iraq.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Could I ask a question?
Please.
Toby, I just wondered what you could say about what has been studied, what has been found about the experience of the birth mothers in China and other places, how they feel about it.
Is there one more question?
My name is Veronica. I have a question for all of the panelists, but especially Sonia. You spoke about how neoliberalism is eroding the welfare state. I was wondering, are there any efforts that go into, I guess, transforming the conditions that propel migrant women from their home, and specifically this population rather than just the general development of the state?
One more question, and then we'll try to start addressing these issues.
Thank you. I'm blown away by this panel, so thank you all so much. I actually had a question for you, Yasmin. I found your presentation to be wildly depressing, but also illuminating. Not that you delivered it in a depressing way, but the subject matter is hard. And I wonder if you could talk about what your recommendation would be as a strategy in how to recognize the women that actually do give birth. What is the right category under the law for this, this invaluable work and more? Thanks.
Why don't we start with the first question?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Actually, I'm not aware of this study, but I think the value is it has brought up the positive effects of migration, and what you said is very true. It is due to the relatively more open environment to migrant domestic workers, and also better protection of their rights. So they have more possibilities for themselves for personal development. It is true, for example, one of our affiliates, the Thai Domestic Workers Union in Hong Kong. Many leaders in the union actually they do have they have worked in Hong Kong for a long time, so their children are big, etc. And the economic pressure for them to continue to work as migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong is no longer there. But they said I prefer to continue to stay in Hong Kong because here I feel I have more rights because I'm the chair of the union. I can go to speak like what I'm doing now, and they feel they have more sense of satisfaction than when they will go home and where they will be just a grandmother of someone and this kind of opportunity will not be there, and also yes, in Hong Kong there are many migrant domestic workers organizations. So there are lots of activities. I mean, every Sunday, if you are in Hong Kong, you see thousands of domestic workers everywhere, and then I mean, every Sunday there are some demonstrations. I guarantee, and also a lot of cultural, social activities, a lot of workshops, conferences. So they do have the possibilities, for self-development, to advocate their rights. They feel they are in control to a certain extent, to be able to speak up and to influence the policies. And what I want to say is it's very important for governments to provide, to create this rights-based and enabling environment, so that the positive impacts of migration can come out. I mean, otherwise, this will not be possible. And even I mean, outside the labor rights sphere, many domestic workers from Indonesia, for example, they say they like to work in Hong Kong because they feel they are free to express their religious beliefs. Especially for those who come from a certain Muslim community in some very restrictive places in their country, and when they are in Hong Kong, and it just happened that they are Christian or they are other believers, they feel they are free to express and to practice, and then also there are women who are lesbians. They also feel, in Hong Kong they are free to love whoever they want to love, but when they are back in the countries, because of the cultural reason, they are not able to do this. So, there are a lot of this kind of experiences, and and I say that, this is what we hope to achieve for all the migrant domestic workers, no matter where they work, a free, protected environment for them to do what they like to do.
Toby? So research on birth parents or birth mothers is extremely difficult in many countries to conduct, and in China it's been especially hard because of the situation in which Chinese parents abandon their kids, which is secretly. There is one researcher, Kay Johnson, who is a China scholar at Hampshire College. She's also one of the first American adoptive moms. And she has a book called Wanting a Daughter, Needing a Son. She was able, with two Chinese colleagues, to do quite a bit of research among families who did give up their kids. And the mothers pretty consistently felt in a bind, and I think that the title sort of captures it all. So in rural areas, families are often allowed to have two kids. If the first child is a boy, they can try again for a girl. So, I'm sorry, the other way around, of course, the other way around. So girl first, try for a boy, and sometimes they will try again and again, and they will keep giving up the girls. But the other piece of it that Kate found, aside from that it was very hard to talk about all of this, and it was very emotional, and these mothers are terribly sad about it, was that many families desperately want a girl too, and it just depends on how these policies are implemented. So China has very strict laws, but very mixed up implementation. So it depends on where you are in China and what a particular local official is doing. So you can sort of get away with having a lot more kids in some places than others. So there is a lot more variation in the outcomes than we would think. But the other so Kay did her work in the early 90s, published in the mid-90s, and she actually has an essay in my book too. The Jenna, who's the young woman who I mentioned, hasn't published her work yet, but on the interview that I saw, she talked about how well, of course, it's a self-selecting thing. The 50 families who came forward were obviously willing to come forward and really wanted to find their child. But what struck her, and she's in her early 20s, was how much they seemed to have loved the baby and how they remembered every little detail. And she was very moved by that personally and felt, oh, maybe this was the case for me as well. And finally, it was very interesting. After all this happened in the last month or two, I saw Jenna's interview, and then over the email, Kay Johnson, the scholar I mentioned earlier, circulated a post, and it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this. It came from a Chinese birth family saying, please send this everywhere you can think of. And it was a page-long description of exactly where they had left their baby girl, how old she was, what she was wearing, how she was wrapped, everything you could think of about her. They left her when she was, I think, a month old or something. And saying, please, if anybody has any information, we'd like you to know. So this was a post that went out to the world, was circulated on the internet globally. I have no idea somebody may well respond. But I think it suggests, maybe it's an easing of policy in China. I have no idea exactly what this is about, but there seems to be a kind of openness that there wasn't there before. And just one other thing, there is a small study that some researchers in Boston have done of about 50 reunions. There actually have been some searches and reunions with birth families. A very small number, but still sort of dramatic given the situation. And the number of kids that these families have, other kids, it complicates the picture. It wasn't the standard, well, they only had one boy and then, one girl and then had a second boy. Some of them actually had multiple kids. Some of them were relatively rich. Some of them were poor. So there seems to be, as always, the standard models don't totally fit.
Yasmin, would you want to?
Yes. So I think it's actually almost impossible and probably not advisable to choose between the two frames of labor and family. And I think one of the consequences of the women's movement of the late 20th century has been precisely to push at the limits of those frames. That being said, as in all of law, as in all of contract, what really matters is where the defaults are set. And so, whereas in adoption, and we've just seen how complicated that is, but the default is clearly set that the woman who gives birth is the mother, the struggle that's going on now is over where the default should be set in surrogacy. I believe that actually, in this sense, adoption is the right model. I think that you need to recognize rights to the woman who's going to give birth to the child. That is not something which demands negating the rights of the father, of the biological father as the intended father. There's a whole other legal question, an international legal question, and then a legal question in most domestic orders, because traditionally, conventionally, the rights of fathers are associated to their relationship to the woman who gives birth. The common law rule is the father is he who the nuptials give evidence of, not the father is the biological father of the child. And that's a rule that served to protect men from paternity suits, by the way, historically. But the point is that you can recognize rights to an intended father who is also a biological father and recognize rights to a woman who gives birth. It shifts the risk. It shifts the burden of the risk. However, it also recognizes the corporeal reality of the identity between a woman and her body. I also strongly think, and that in this, it's not what most people generally say. Many people say, oh, this is sort of old feminists making an alliance with reactionary, conservative, religious forces who are also against surrogacy. I don't think that's the way it actually is going to play out. Because I think that if you get more into the details, not to recognize the rights of the woman who gives birth or the identity of the woman who gives birth to being the mother, ultimately leads to jeopardizing abortion rights and the right to choose. Because it institutes a distinction between the embryo and the fetus and the developing child in such a way that that embryo, fetus, developing child becomes a subject-object of rights that are distinct from the mother's rights in her own body, from the pregnant woman's rights in her own body. And so that, I think, is in the long run a worrying, an independently worrying development. But, you know, that's what the question is. The question, and I should say that whereas in the United States what I'm saying seems like heresy, there are countries that legislate exactly like this. And that say, yes, you can recognize a surrogacy arrangement, but you need to give the woman who has given birth a chance to give up